I work for the Resolution Foundation, which is a UK-based and UK-focused think tank that does economic and policy research with the goal of improving living standards for people on lower and middle incomes. And so in organising this session, the organisers asked me to kind of address this question, which I've got up in my title, specifically from a UK perspective. So if any of you don't want a sort of 20-minute education in UK economics and policy, you should leave the room now, to be honest. So I'm going to direct my presentation very squarely at this question. Is the labour market contributing to growing disparities in income and opportunity? So before I go through trying to answer this question, I'll just give you some brief points of context. The first is a spoiler. Like most economic questions, my answer is going to be on the one hand yes and on the other hand no. The second thing to note is that at the Resolution Foundation we have an unofficial motto, which is changing the world one chart at a time. We really, really like charts, so there's going to be a lot of them, but I'm going to try and bring out the key points for the non-chart lovers. And the third kind of admission at the start is I've found my personal well-being over recent years has been greatly improved by completely ignoring what's going on in British politics. So I was going to try and not mention Brexit at all, but then it has kind of crept into my slides. So we'll come back to it, and I'm not that happy, but I'll definitely discuss it over a drink later if you'd like. Anyway, that forward. Oh. Oh. Green screen. This isn't going to go well for the charts. Shall I try now? Great. Okay, so in answering the question, are work and wages in the UK contributing to growing disparities in income and opportunity, I'm going to try and do 5 things. And first, I'm going to briefly provide a bit of UK versus kind of other countries' context, setting out why I think the answer to this question is a bit different in the UK than it might be in other advanced economies. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the case for no, work and wages in the UK are actually reducing economic disparities. And I'm going to show you some really positive trends in some of the headline numbers. And then I'm going to make the case for yes, and show you how some other trends that affect how those numbers feed through to household living standards or affect the perceptions or the experience of work are pushing in the other direction. And then I'm going to demonstrate that these concerns about what's going on in our labour market are particularly acute when we look through a generational lens, and generational debates, and that's one of the reasons why generational debates have become increasingly salient in the UK as elsewhere. And finally, I'll set out where I think that leaves us in terms of policy conclusions. So first, to set out our question in the particular UK context, I've got 3 quick contextual points to make. And the first is that while the past decade hasn't been great for living standards anywhere, it's been particularly terrible in the UK. And this chart demonstrates this by showing real changes in real GDP per capita since 2007 as an index. Real GDP per capita being a pretty good summary measure of living standards. So 2 things are clear from this. The first is that the UK had a particularly deep crisis between 2007 and 2009, around a 6% reduction in GDP per capita compared to kind of roughly 4% in the comparator areas I'm showing. And the second is the recovery hasn't really closed any of that gap. So today, real GDP per capita in the UK is about 4% higher than it was 11 years ago. It's compared to nearly 6% in Canada, close to 8% across the G7 in the EU, and getting on for 10% in the OECD and the US. So to relate this back to the question at hand, I think that when growth has been so muted overall, it makes these questions we're dealing with at this conference of its distribution all the more important and really affects individuals' and workers' views of fairness and opportunity. My second contextual point relates to the nature of that very big downturn I just talked about. And the main thing I have to say in this slide is I'm really sorry that Canada's not on it. What this chart shows, if we focus first on the blue bars, is that unemployment, the increase in unemployment in the Great Recession was much lower in the UK than it was in most other advanced economies. But I've just told you that the UK had a much deeper crisis overall, a much deeper fall in output than most other places. So why did that happen? Well, the answer is shown on the gold bars. So the gold bars show over roughly the same period the change in real earnings in all of these countries. What happened in the UK is we traded off much smaller falls and much smaller increases in unemployment that we've had in previous recessions and than other countries had for a really deep decrease in real earnings. which came about due to the devaluation of our currency in 2008, which pushed up inflation. So if we compare to someone like the US, unemployment went up only about half as much, but real earnings were sort of 7 to 8% lower over the crisis period and have been sluggish since. So our crisis was quite different to the ones that we had in the 80s and 90s and the ones that happened in lots of other places. Portugal was obviously worse, but I tend to kind of take Portugal, Italy, and Spain off most charts because they've had a really bad time, if you thought what I was saying was bad. So my final contextual point comes back to this concept of the labour share, which both Caroline and David have talked about. And we've heard that in general across advanced economies, things like technology and globalisation and falling unionisation have driven down the labour share, so more of the proceeds of outputs going to company profits rather than to workers. So we can see the labour share across a number of advanced economies on this chart as an index. And we see that in most places, if we measure since 1980, as both David and Caroline told us, it has fallen. But I really want to point out that the UK is a bit of an outlier on this chart. There were some bumps through the 80s and 90s, but actually over the course of the 21st century, the labour share, so the share of growth that is going to workers' compensation, has been flat in the UK rather than declining. So more of the proceeds of growth going to capitalists is a good answer to growing disparities in other countries, but we can't really make it the culprit in the UK. So let's be cheerful for a bit. With that as context, let me give you 3 key reasons why we might conclude that the labour market's actually been reducing economic disparities over recent decades in the UK. The first relates to the pattern of growth in hourly earnings over the past 2 decades. So what this chart shows is percentiles of hourly earnings ranked from the lowest earning on the left-hand side to the highest earning on the right-hand side. And for each of these points in the earnings distribution, it shows the average rate of annual hourly earnings growth over 20 years. It's been a pretty meagre, just below 1% in the middle, but much, much stronger at the bottom, up to 2.5% at the very bottom. And a really big driver, and what that means, this kind of, I don't know, weird Nike swoosh shape, is reduced hourly earnings inequality over these 2 decades. That's a positive. And the really big thing that's driven it is the introduction of the UK minimum wage in 1999. Since it was introduced, it's been increasing as a share of hourly earnings, particularly since 2015 when a new higher rate was introduced for workers aged 25 and over. There's very little evidence of negative employment effects from this minimum wage. It's widely regarded as a really, really successful policy. And as such, the government's planning to go even further. They're currently working with US academic Aaron Dubé to see if we can push the minimum wage up to 2/3 of earnings and effectively abolish low pay. So a really, really positive context in terms of the success of the minimum wage in reducing hourly earnings inequality. 2 quick caveats. There is something going on at the top here. It's the middle that's been worst. We have had some faster increases in earnings at the top. I think this speaks to what some of Mike was telling us earlier. And the second big thing is this chart measures since 1998. So it doesn't capture the 80s and early 90s. If I had a chart of that, it would be inequality increasing to a much greater extent. Truly enormous increases in inequality in the 80s, which will have driven what Brian told us in the first session about rising income inequality in the UK over the whole 4 decades. All of that increase in income inequality in the UK happened in the 1980s, basically. It's been pretty much flat since 1990. So although this is a positive recent 2 decades, it comes off the back of an even worse inequality increasing 2 decades before that. Nonetheless, in terms of the 21st century, really good news, driven by a really successful policy on minimum wages. Okay, so my second bit of good news relates to employment. We had really low unemployment increases in the recession, and we've had really, really strong and unexpected employment growth since then. Employment quickly recovered the jobs lost during the downturn, and then it kept on going up. We've now got record high employment in the UK. I'm sorry to tell you, I think we overtook Canada in about 2015 in terms of our rankings on employment rates, so we're doing better than you guys now. And what this employment increase has done as we've reached record highs is it's attracted traditionally more disadvantaged groups into the jobs market. And this is demonstrated by these 2 charts. So on the left-hand side, I've plotted the overall employment rate in 2008, and then the 2008 employment rates of some traditionally low employment groups. So the lowest qualified third of the population, ethnic minority groups, single parents and disabled people. And the right-hand chart shows the rate of increase over the 10 years since. So the average rate of increase for all workers, for the whole 16 to 64-year-old population was 2.8 percentage points. We can see that all these groups that started out as lower employment have had much faster rates of employment increase over the past decade. That's been really positive in terms of closing employment gaps between groups and areas in the UK. The three areas, parts of the country listed at the bottom, were the three that started out with the lowest employment in 2008. For those who know a bit of UK geography, the Merseyside is Liverpool, where the Beatles came from. The metropolitan West Midlands is Birmingham. There's a band called Duran Duran that came from there. I think they were big in the 80s. And South Yorkshire is the Sheffield City region. And for maybe people a bit more around my age in the room, that's where the Arctic Monkeys are from, who were big in the 2000s. I believe that they all made it in North America. I did actually Google that earlier. Anyway, I've gone off topic. Away from music, back to the labour market. Stronger employment growth for low activity groups, a really big driver of closing employment gaps, really positive in terms of the past decade. Final bit of positive news is in relation to educational attainment. This chart shows educational attainment, the proportion with degrees of those in their late 20s, on the red and pink bars back in the late 90s, and on the blue bars today. So the first thing we can see is there's been a really big rate of increase in educational attainment across groups, and that reflects massive rises in university attendance in the 90s and early 2000s. And the second big thing we can see is that these increases have been particularly strong for originally lower degree attainment groups. So, for example, if we look towards the bottom of the chart, white women and black men and women started out with lower than average rates of degree attainment when in their late 20s. They're now all above average. Back in the late 90s, Indian men were more than 3 times as likely to have a degree as Pakistani and Bangladeshi women. Now there's no group with an educational attainment rate 3 times of any other group. So we've had a narrowing of educational attainment gaps by ethnicity and sex. Okay, so that's the cheerful bit done. There is, I think, some strong evidence of narrowing divides over the past 2 decades. But the question is, does this feed through to how workers feel? And I think there's good evidence if you just read a UK newspaper that it doesn't. So here's 3 forces that I think partly explain that in terms of pushing in the other direction. The first relates to the hours of work that people do. And this is probably my most complicated chart, so I'll just explain what's going on here. If we focus on men on the left-hand side first, we've got, across the bottom, we've got pay relative to median hourly pay. So on the left-hand side, we've got the lowest hourly paid people. On the right-hand side, the highest hourly paid people. On the lines, we've got the average weekly hours of work they do. So 1997 in the green, 2016 in the red. And what we can see is that hours have reduced overall over this 2 decades or so, but they've reduced particularly for those at or below, particularly below median hourly pay, and that's a particularly marked effect for men. Now, some of this might reflect positive trends. I think it kind of speaks to some of what David told us about part-time work. It might reflect things like men doing more childcare, for example. But there's also powerful evidence that these lower skilled men doing fewer hours aren't happy with that fact. They're much more likely to be underemployed, for example, even given record low or 40-year low levels of unemployment in the UK. And so the result is that those minimum wage-driven reductions in hourly earnings inequality that I showed you a few slides ago haven't fed through to weekly earnings or household incomes because they've been counteracted by falling hours of work in the bottom half of the distribution. So the kind of Nike swoosh shaped chart I showed you for hourly earnings inequality, for hourly earnings growth rather, if I showed you a weekly one, it would just be completely flat. That was all a bit complicated. I'll just repeat the key message. The big gains in reduced hourly earnings inequality have not fed through at all to household incomes because of changes in the patterns of hours worked, particularly by low-skilled men. So I think the second headwind really speaks to a lot of what David was talking about, and that is a rise in insecure and atypical, non-standard maybe forms of employment in the UK over the past couple of decades, over the crisis period in particular. So I've split the different types of non-standard employment out onto 2 charts just because of the differences in scale. But what we could see is that across all forms, we've had kind of either steady increases or particularly rapid increases around or after the crisis in these types of non-standard work. The ones on the right-hand side are kind of particular names for non-standard contracts we have in the UK. Agency work is kind of working for an umbrella company rather than being employed by an umbrella company rather than the firm you're supplying labour for. And 0 hours contracts, you've got a contract of employment with the firm, but from 1 week to the next, they can give you no hours, some hours. It's very much up to them. The media really got onto these in 2012, by the way, which is some of the reason why this line shoots up, but there's some real increases underlying that. So I think the important point, these went up a lot around the crisis, but the really important point is they haven't unwound back to previous levels as we've moved to record high employment and 40-year low unemployment. What it looks like is that there's been a bit of path dependence or something like that going on. Employers have got used to doing these kind of things. Maybe they were necessary to prevent unemployment rising more in the crisis, but they've stayed as the labour market's tightened. And that suggests that they might have become the new norm and some policy action might be needed. Now, we might be concerned about these things just because we don't like the idea of insecurity, but there's also strong evidence that workers are less satisfied on these types of contracts, and they carry a pay penalty compared to similar workers on secure full-time employment contracts. So a real cause for concern. And my final concerning point, again, it speaks to what David was talking about. We've had declines in worker power. Partly this comes from lower rates of unionisation in the UK. We've had a steady decline in the proportion of people in employment, or the proportion of employees who are in a union, as you can see on this chart. And we've also had falling rates of job-to-job moves. They're still 1/3 below their pre-crisis high, even given record high employment. And the reason why I mentioned that on this slide is because job moves represent a threat to employers in terms of exiting work. They're one of the things that keeps wages high. When employers see staff going, they tend to raise wages for remaining staff to prevent further losses. And they're also a way we get productive capacity around the economy more quickly. So I think a lower exit threat to employers and lower bargaining via unionisation are two forms in which worker power has declined over the long term in the UK. So very quickly, I will talk about how the new dividing line of age has come along alongside some of the dividing lines I've talked about, like earnings level, gender, region, ethnicity, in kind of representing the new big divide in our labour market. And the really simple message of the following slides is that some of the more concerning labour market trends I've talked about have bitten hardest for the young. So very quickly, we talked about a really big real earnings squeeze. If you were young, it was much, much bigger. So about 7% fall in real earnings between 2009 and 2014 overall, over 9% if you were under 30. We've talked about a rise and in the endurance of non-standard forms of employment. Much bigger rise and much more enduring rise in the two examples I've shown here if you were under 30 than if you were over 30. You were pretty much always more likely to be in these types of work, but you're even more likely today if you're young than you were 10 years ago. And I've talked about the problem of declining job mobility, lower exit threat for employers, job moves being the best way to get your personal pay rises going up. Again, this decline in job mobility has been particularly marked, and it's much more important in general to move jobs when you're under 30. So the conclusion here is that some of the concerning labour market patterns I've talked about are particularly acute for the young. And this comes alongside other trends that aren't in the labour market. So to name a few, we've had big declines in home ownership. We've had a shift in the type of pensions workers have from kind of generous defined benefit or final salary, they're often called in the US schemes, to much less generous and riskier defined contribution schemes. And we've had welfare benefits for working age families cut while pensioner benefits have been protected. So I think if you put these labour market trends by age alongside other generational trends, it's easy to understand why generational divides are rising in salience in the UK, alongside other kinds of divides, which are still, I would argue, much too high, but have often, or at least in some cases, been declining. And at the Resolution Foundation, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about these generational divides. So we ran a big project called the Intergenerational Commission between 2016 and 2018. And one of the things we did in this project is we did some polling of the British public and asked them what they thought about generational fairness. And the answers were really, really clear. People across age groups, including the old, thought that it was a mark of a good society that each generation should have higher living standards than the one before. But by a margin of 2 to 1, they thought that wasn't happening for today's young people. And historical polling shows that this isn't just the fact that people are always pessimistic. That's a big shift. It used to be 4-1 in the other direction back in the 90s, I think. And this is where I break my promise not to talk about Brexit. Obviously, I've done a presentation with loads of charts about economics, but this generational thing in Britain is not just about economics. It's really shaping our fractured politics. Now, I'm not a betting person, but I was asked, we did an office sweepstake last week, and I think I voted for the fact that we won't leave the EU by the 31st of October deadline, that an election will have been called by then, and that Boris Johnson will still be Prime Minister. And I'm pretty sure those are possibly all a bit inconsistent with one another. But I change my mind from day to day, but I think it's probably more than 50% likely we're going to have an election in October or November. When we do, we have to recognise the massive change in how people vote by age that's happened over the past 4 decades or so. So just briefly, this chart on the left shows on the dotted lines people's chance of voting Labour or Conservative by age back in the mid-70s election. There were differences, but they're nowhere near as big as the differences in the 2017 election. So, 3 times as likely to vote Labour as Conservative if you're in your 20s, somewhere around the other way around if you're in your 70s. This election is going to be fought into and along these generational cleavages like never before. And obviously, there's all this Brexit stuff in the background, which we also know was hugely divided by age in terms of whether people voted Leave or Remain. So I spend a lot of time showing charts about generational fairness, but I think because of what our polling of the public tells us, and because of what's going on in our politics and how people of different ages are voting, it's just unavoidable in Britain today. It's kind of shaping everything. So for that reason, as well as many others, I think it won't surprise you to know there is a case for policy action. I've just got a couple more slides. I'll give you some policy thoughts and then some quick conclusions. So I won't go into too much detail on policy, using the same excuse as a few other people before me, although it is actually my job to tell the government what to do, so I probably shouldn't back out of it like the academics can. So what I'll do is I'll give 3 broad areas where I think there is a case for policy reform on the basis of what I've said, and then I'll show you just some examples of specific policy recommendations we at the Resolution Foundation have made, and these come from the Intergenerational Commission we did that I mentioned, which had a big suite of policy recommendations as part of the project. So, policy priorities. The first, and these actually echo pretty well with what David said, which is very pleasing. The first is, I think you always have to balance the case for kind of tighter regulation, reductions in flexibility, reductions in insecurity, against kind of the potential employment effects that those measures might have. But we've got record high employment in the UK. We've got 40-year low unemployment. If we're going to do something about this stuff, given it hasn't gone away as the labour market's tightened, now is the time to do it. Well, maybe not now because we're about to no-deal Brexit, but maybe like a year ago when I originally wrote these recommendations. But anyway, so here's an example of some specific recommendations we made in the Intergenerational Commission about some of the things you might do. They're incremental, they're not super radical, but we should be kind of pushing the boundaries of insecurity at a time of record high employment and give workers a bit more of what they crave without threatening the total number of jobs. The second is focus on education. For us in the UK, it's particularly about vocational education, which has been the kind of Cinderella part of education versus universities for 40 years. As part of our Intergenerational Commission, we focused on funding to support training for those in work, stuck in low-paid jobs, stuck in low-skilled jobs, given that low rate of job mobility, particularly young people, to train to take up better opportunities, and some money to plug the persistent underfunding of vocational education in the UK, which has consistently lost out to both universities and schools, by which I mean not universities or colleges. I get confused about the lingo here, but anyway, high schools, basically. So the final element, again echoing what David said, I think is really important, is about addressing that worker power aspect, the unionisation and the low rates of job move, providing little exit threat. We offered some recommendations in our Intergenerational Commission about enhancing union rights and getting more young people into unions in the UK via lower rates and use of tech. We're also just kicking off a project on how our institutions that do labour market enforcement can be strengthened, given the proliferation of types of employment contracts, given a very high minimum wage, meaning you're likely to need more enforcement to make sure that minimum wage actually happens, etc. So I think these are the kind of the right areas to be focusing. These are some examples of policies, but there'll be other ones. So I managed to stick to time just about. So just to kind of wrap up what you've hopefully taken away from my presentation, we've got to understand, well, you probably don't have to, but I every day have to understand the particular UK context we're working in. We had a particularly deep crisis, a different kind of crisis to lots of other places with much more of a role for falling pay than rising unemployment. And we can't blame the labour share like you guys can. There's some really good news in the headline numbers. Narrowing hourly earnings inequality, employment increases, reducing gaps between groups and areas, and also reduce gaps in education and attainment. Maybe this doesn't feel that good for people though, and that's because changes in hours worked mean the falling earnings inequality isn't feeding through to household incomes. We've got rising insecure and atypical work, and we've got lower worker power. This is particularly acute for younger generations and sits alongside wider changes in housing, wealth and welfare that are really reshaping what it feels like to grow up in Britain today. And I think policy action does have a role to play in the face of these outcomes, working to protect record employment, but take measured steps to reduce insecurities, imbalances, and correct educational underinvestment. Thanks very much for your time today, and I look forward to taking your questions.